Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Daniel Blake had spent years upholding the law, but he never expected to become the target of a ruthless HOA president drunk on power. When Karen Wilson's demands were met with defiance, she escalated from petty harassment to outright crime. But she had no idea. Her chosen victim was a federal judge, and he was ready to fight back. Daniel Blake had spent years enforcing the law with precision and unwavering resolve. As a federal judge, he was no stranger to power struggles and legal disputes, but never in his life did he expect to find himself in a personal battle over something as fundamental as his own home. After decades of service, he had finally purchased a house in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, a private property, free from the overreaching grasp of any homeowners association. Nestled at the edge of the community, his home was outside the HOA's jurisdiction, and the legal documents confirmed it. The property was his alone, shielded from the excessive rules and regulations that HOA boards so often wielded like a weapon. He had chosen this house precisely because he wanted peace, free from bureaucratic meddling. But peace, as he would soon find out, was not something that Karen Wilson, the iron-fisted president of the Wellington Pines HOA, was willing to allow. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a letter, formal yet condescending, demanding that he bring his property into compliance with the neighborhood's guidelines. The accusations were vague: an unauthorized fence, landscaping violations, and a failure to submit HOA dues, fees that he was under no obligation to pay. Daniel skimmed the document, unimpressed. A clerical mistake, he assumed, and tossed the letter aside. But then Karen came in person. It was a crisp Monday morning when Daniel opened his front door to the sight of a middle-aged woman standing stiffly on his porch, clutching a clipboard with a self-righteous air. She wore the expression of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," she said, the sharpness of her tone undermining the pleasantry. "I'm Karen Wilson, president of the Wellington Pines HOA, and I'm here to discuss some urgent violations regarding your property." Daniel studied her for a moment. He had encountered her type before: authoritarian, power-hungry, the kind of person who derived their sense of self-worth from exerting control over others. He had seen figures like her crumble in court when their flimsy justifications were met with actual legal authority. "I don't believe we have anything to discuss," he replied, his voice measured but firm. "My property isn't part of the HOA. You must be mistaken." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's a common misconception. This neighborhood is governed by strict community standards, and regardless of technicalities, all residents are expected to follow them." Daniel crossed his arms. "Technicalities? You mean laws?" Karen exhaled sharply, clearly unused to defiance. "Let's not be difficult, Mr. Blake. We all want what's best for the community. If you'd just cooperate and sign the compliance agreement, we can avoid unnecessary conflict." She handed him a stack of forms, a demand for HOA membership, back payments for HOA dues, and an order to remove his fence and repaint his house in an approved color scheme. Daniel didn't even glance at the papers before stepping back inside. "I suggest you check your records, Ms. Wilson. I'm not a member, and I have no intention of becoming one." And with that, he shut the door in her face. But Karen wasn't finished. Over the next few days, the harassment escalated. Another letter arrived, this one more forceful, threatening fines if he did not correct his non-compliance. His security cameras captured HOA representatives lurking near his property, taking photographs. Neighbors he hadn't even met before started glancing at him with suspicion, whispering as he walked by. Then came the final straw. One morning, Daniel stepped outside and found a bright red notice nailed to his front door. It read, "Final warning. Failure to comply will result in enforcement action." Daniel stared at the sign, his jaw tightening. This was not a simple misunderstanding. This was an attempted power grab. Karen had made a critical mistake. She thought she was dealing with just another homeowner. She had no idea who she was up against. Daniel knew that bullies didn't stop when ignored. They escalated, and Karen Wilson was proving to be no exception. The second letter came with a larger font, bolder threats, and an increased fine for non-compliance. It cited a laundry list of supposed violations: the color of his shutters, the design of his front porch, and even the placement of his trash bins. All of it, of course, was nonsense. He had never signed a single HOA agreement. But Karen wasn't just relying on letters. Within days, Daniel noticed unfamiliar cars slowing down in front of his house, their drivers snapping photos of his property. His security cameras captured HOA board members hovering near his yard, pointing and whispering. One evening, he overheard two of them talking just outside his driveway. "He's setting a bad precedent," one muttered. "If we let him get away with this, others might start questioning us." The other replied. Daniel didn't need to hear more. This wasn't just about him. It was about power. The next move was as predictable as it was petty. One morning, he stepped outside to find that someone had dumped garbage bags onto his lawn. Torn open bags, coffee grounds staining the grass, junk mail addressed to random neighbors scattered across his property. An attempt to make it look like he was neglecting his home. That same day, he received a visit from city code enforcement officers. "Mr. Blake," the lead inspector said, adjusting his clipboard, "we've received complaints about piles of trash and excessive debris on your property. We're here to investigate a potential violation." Daniel took a slow breath, suppressing his irritation. "Do you often investigate complaints made within hours of trash appearing?" The inspector hesitated. Well, we have to take all reports seriously." Daniel gestured to his security cameras. "That's good to hear, because I have footage of who actually dumped this garbage. Would you like to watch it together?" The inspectors exchanged nervous glances. By the end of the day, Daniel had the footage downloaded and archived, ready for future use. But if Karen thought a little staged trash would intimidate him, she was about to learn otherwise. Her next tactic was even bolder. One evening, as Daniel returned from work, he noticed a group of neighbors gathered near the HOA clubhouse. Curious, he parked and walked closer, just in time to hear Karen giving a speech. "And that's why we must remain vigilant," she declared, her voice carrying across the small crowd. "If we allow certain individuals to ignore the rules, it diminishes the value of our community. We've already seen signs of declining property values because of, well, you know who." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Daniel folded his arms, stepping forward. "I'd love to hear some evidence for that claim, Ms. Wilson." Karen's smug expression faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Mr. Blake, how nice of you to join us. We were just discussing our neighborhood standards." Daniel smirked. "Oh, I heard. So just to clarify, you're publicly accusing me of lowering property values?" Karen smiled tightly. "We're simply concerned about outsiders disrupting our community's harmony." Daniel let the silence stretch between them. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "You mean property owners exercising their legal rights?" Karen's face darkened. He turned to the crowd. "Has it occurred to anyone to fact-check these claims? Or are you all just taking her word for it?" A few people shifted uncomfortably. A couple even avoided Karen's gaze. Daniel took one last look at Karen, who stood rigid, her fists clenched. She wasn't done, and he knew it. But neither was he. The first sign that Karen had crossed the line from petty harassment to outright criminal behavior came one evening when Daniel noticed two police cruisers pulling into his driveway. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie reflections across his windows, and within moments 3 uniformed officers stepped out, their hands resting near their belts. Daniel set down his coffee, stepped onto the porch, and met them at the edge of his property. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. One of them, a stocky man with a rigid stance, took a step forward. "Sir, we received a disturbance call about an unregistered resident trespassing on this property. HOA representatives informed us that you have been illegally occupying this house and refusing to comply with community regulations." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Illegal occupancy. This is my home." Before the officer could respond, Daniel spotted a familiar figure standing triumphantly near the street. Karen, arms folded, watching the scene with barely contained smug satisfaction. "I see," Daniel said, exhaling slowly. He turned back to the officers. "Can I see some identification, please?" The lead officer's jaw tightened. "Excuse me." "Your badges. I'd like to see your names and department affiliations." A brief, charged silence hung between them. The second officer, a younger man with nervous energy, glanced toward his partner. "We're responding to a lawful HOA complaint," the stocky officer said. "Sir, I need you to step aside while we—" "You need a warrant to step onto my property," Daniel interrupted. His voice remained steady, but there was a steel edge to it now. You also need jurisdiction, and I seriously doubt your department is in the habit of enforcing HOA bylaws. He could feel Karen's eyes burning into him from across the yard. The younger officer hesitated. Sir, if you could just cooperate, we can clear this up quickly." Daniel sighed and reached into his back pocket, not for his wallet, but for his own badge. The moment the golden federal emblem caught the streetlights, the entire dynamic shifted. The two younger officers immediately stiffened, their eyes widening. The stocky one, however, tried to maintain his composure. "Sir, You're impersonating a police officer," Daniel said, his voice razor-sharp. "That's a felony under federal law, so I'll ask you one more time. Who do you actually work for?" A bead of sweat formed on the lead officer's forehead. "We were hired by the HOA," Daniel finished for him. He turned toward Karen, who was now looking considerably less confident. "You're not real police officers. You're private security dressed in fake uniforms, hoping I wouldn't notice." The younger officer took a step back, clearly realizing the severity of the situation. The lead officer, however, clenched his jaw. "Sir, we were just trying to—" Daniel pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "I need actual law enforcement at my residence immediately," he said clearly. "I have 2 men impersonating officers on my property, sent by an HOA president in an attempt to force an unlawful eviction." The moment Karen heard the words impersonating officers, her face turned a ghastly shade of white. "Wait, this is all just a misunderstanding," she blurted out, rushing forward. "Mr. Blake, let's be reasonable, like you were reasonable when you lied to the police." Daniel shot back. "When you tried to have me forcibly removed from my own home?" A long, dead silence followed. Karen's confidence had finally cracked, but she had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The real police arrived within minutes. 2 marked patrol cars rolled up to Daniel's driveway, their lights flashing ominously in the night. Karen stood frozen near the curb, her self-satisfied smirk long gone, replaced by something resembling dawning panic. The 2 fake officers, now visibly sweating, tensed as the real authorities approached. One of the actual officers, a tall man with sharp eyes, stepped out and immediately took stock of the scene. His gaze flicked from the fake officers, still in their phony police uniforms, to Daniel, who stood calmly with his arms crossed, his federal badge still visible in his hand. "Mr. Blake," the officer said. Daniel gave him a curt nod. "Thanks for coming, officer. I assume your department doesn't typically send units to enforce homeowners association bylaws?" The officer's brow furrowed. "No, sir, we do not." Daniel gestured toward the 2 imposters who now looked ready to bolt. "Then perhaps you'd like to ask these men why they've been posing as law enforcement officers to attempt an illegal removal from my property." The real officers turned their attention to the fake cops, their expressions hardening. "Badges," the lead officer demanded, holding out his hand. The 2 men hesitated. Then one of them made the mistake of running. "Hey!" one of the real cops shouted as he lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. Gravel scraped against skin as the phony officer yelped, his arms pinned behind his back. The second man, too stunned to move, immediately threw up his hands. Karen staggered backward, her face pale. "This is all a misunderstanding," she stammered, looking desperately between Daniel and the police. "They were just neighborhood security. I didn't mean for this to happen." Daniel stepped toward her, his calm gaze like a blade. "Neighborhood security?" he echoed. "Do neighborhood security officers typically wear police uniforms, carry fake badges, and attempt to detain legal homeowners?" Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. By now, the real officers had both imposters in handcuffs, reading them their rights. "You're under arrest for impersonating law enforcement," one of them said. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Karen flinched, her hands trembling as the reality of the situation began to set in, but she wasn't off the hook yet. The lead officer turned back toward Daniel. "Can you tell me exactly what happened here, sir?" Daniel nodded and handed over his phone, already queued up to the security footage. "Everything's on camera. These men showed up claiming to be police officers and tried to intimidate me into vacating my home. They cited false violations and refused to show proper identification. When I pressed them, they hesitated because they're not real cops. They were sent by her." He turned and pointed directly at Karen. Karen gasped, her whole body jerking backward as if she had been physically struck. That's a lie, she shrieked. I had no idea they weren't real officers. I was just... Then why did you tell them I was trespassing in my own home? Daniel interrupted smoothly. Why did you call in a false police report, claiming I was a danger to the community? One of the officers narrowed his eyes. Ms. Wilson will need to speak with you at the station. This is a serious matter. Karen whipped around in desperation, searching for someone, anyone who might defend her. But the small group of HOA board members who had gathered to watch the scene unfold were now edging away from her, their faces carefully blank. Even they weren't willing to get dragged down with her. Wait, she said, her voice wobbling. I was just trying to keep our community safe. I didn't mean for it to... Ms. Wilson, please place your hands behind your back, the officer said flatly. Karen froze, her mouth working silently. Then, when she realized that they were serious, she screamed. This is insane, she shrieked, struggling as the officer grabbed her wrist. I'm the HOA president. I was just doing my job. Daniel watched impassively as they secured the cuffs around her wrists and began leading her toward the patrol car. You were abusing your power, he corrected. And now, you're finally facing the consequences. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people settled into their seats, anticipation thick in the air. This case had become the talk of the town, drawing attention from both local media and legal circles. After all, it wasn't every day that a homeowners association president stood trial for fraud, false police reports, and conspiracy to commit unlawful eviction. Daniel sat in the front row, watching as Karen Wilson was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, her usual air of superiority replaced by something much more fragile. Her once meticulously styled hair was now a tangled mess, and the confident smirk she had so often worn was nowhere to be seen. This was no longer the woman who had tried to bully and intimidate him into submission. This was a person who finally understood the weight of her actions. The prosecution wasted no time dismantling Karen's defense. They presented surveillance footage from Daniel's property, capturing every staged act of harassment, the fake police officers arriving at his home, Karen watching from the sidelines, and most damningly, her own voice caught on audio, coaching them on what to say. A criminal forensics expert testified that the HOA fines and violation notices Karen had sent to Daniel were fraudulent, containing fabricated legal citations that had no basis in real law. But the worst blow came when one of the arrested fake officers agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. He didn't hold back. I was hired directly by Karen Wilson, the man admitted on the stand. She told us to dress as cops, use intimidating language, and get Daniel Blake to leave. She even told us to make up violations if he resisted. Karen's attorney tried to object, but the damage had already been done. The final nail in the coffin came when Daniel himself took the stand. Facing Karen directly for the first time since her arrest, he recounted every step of her campaign against him: the false violation notices, the staged garbage dump, the HOA smear campaign, and, of course, the attempted unlawful eviction using fake officers. I have spent my career upholding the law, he said, his voice steady but firm. Ms. Wilson believed she was above it. She thought her position in the HOA gave her the right to bend reality to her will, but what she failed to understand is that no one is above the law, not an HOA, not a self-appointed dictator, and certainly not her. The jury took less than 2 hours to return their verdict, guilty, on all counts. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, did not hold back. Ms. Wilson, your actions were not just reckless, they were deliberate and malicious. You used your position to terrorize a homeowner, violated multiple laws regarding false reports, and nearly got away with impersonating law enforcement. Your complete disregard for the rights of others is astounding, and for that, you will be held fully accountable. She banged the gavel and delivered the sentence. 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and filing false police reports. Permanent ban from ever holding a leadership position in an HOA or similar organization. $250,000 in restitution to Daniel for damages, legal fees, and emotional distress. Karen collapsed into her chair, her face pale and drained of all fight. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and for the first time, she looked truly defeated. As she was led away in handcuffs, she turned to Daniel, eyes burning with one last desperate plea. "This isn't fair," she cried. I was only doing what was best for the community. Daniel met her gaze with unshakable calm. No, he said simply, you were doing what was best for yourself, and now you're paying the price. The fall of Karen Wilson sent shockwaves through the Wellington Pines community. For years, she had ruled with unchecked authority, dictating every aspect of homeowners' lives, from the color of their front doors to the height of their grass. But now, with their former president behind bars, the HOA was left in shambles, scrambling to distance itself from her crimes. Daniel watched from a distance as the fallout unfolded. The first major change came within a week of the verdict. A formal HOA meeting was called, but for the first time, it wasn't Karen standing at the podium. Instead, it was a visibly shaken group of remaining board members struggling to maintain a sense of order. We understand that mistakes were made, the interim president Mark Holloway stammered, his hands gripping the podium like a lifeline. And we want to assure you that Wellington Pines HOA is committed to regaining the trust of the community. The response from the crowd was swift and brutal. "Mistakes!" a homeowner shouted. "Karen tried to have a man illegally evicted. She filed false police reports, and you expect us to just move on?" Another resident stood up. "Why should we even have an HOA anymore? What good has it done?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The HOA board members looked at each other nervously. They had expected anger, but what they hadn't prepared for was a complete rejection of the HOA itself. The real turning point came when Daniel himself stepped forward. Up until now, he had preferred to stay out of neighborhood politics, but this was different. "I think it's time we talk about what happens next," he said, his voice carrying over the restless crowd. "Because let's be honest, this HOA didn't just fail because of Karen Wilson. It failed because it allowed her to operate unchecked for years." A hush fell over the audience. "So the real question isn't just how to fix this HOA," Daniel continued. "The question is, do we even need it at all?" For the first time in years, the idea of dissolving the HOA entirely became a real conversation. The board members tried to push back, arguing that the association was necessary to maintain community standards, but they had no credibility left. One by one, homeowners began openly discussing alternatives, self-governance, voluntary neighborhood committees, and even complete disbandment of the HOA. By the end of the meeting, a formal petition had already begun circulating to hold a vote on whether the HOA should be abolished altogether. Within a month, it was official. Wellington Pines HOA was disbanded. The power that Karen had abused for so long was gone forever. In the weeks that followed, Daniel noticed a marked difference in the neighborhood. People were friendlier, more relaxed, almost as if a weight had been lifted off their shoulders. Homeowners made their own decisions about their properties without fear of fines or threats. One evening, as Daniel sat on his porch, enjoying the rare quiet that had eluded him since moving in, he heard footsteps approaching. It was Mark Holloway, the former HOA vice president, now just another neighbor. "Blake," he said with a sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. I wanted to say thank you, and I'm sorry. I should have seen what Karen was doing a long time ago." Daniel studied him for a moment before nodding. "You let it happen," he said, "but at least now you're helping clean up the mess." Mark let out a small, tired chuckle. "Yeah, better late than never, I guess." As he walked away, Daniel leaned back in his chair, taking in the peace of his home, a home he had fought to keep. Karen had tried to bend the law to her will, believing herself untouchable, but in the end, she had only destroyed herself. And as for Wellington Pines, it was finally free.